Good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin. I already have a microphone. Welcome to tonight's panel discussion on the transatlantic relationship between war and peace. So we have just finished our annual Holbrooke Workshop. The American Academy, you may recall, was founded, I'll put it in an archaic way, 106 years ago. Our founders brought forth in this villa a new institution. And the idea was, one of the ideas were that at the time that we would be a place where Americans and Germans and Europeans more broadly would come together to talk about the really difficult issues of the day and the things that were confronting us. And that is what we did today in our discussion about the transatlantic relationship between the election and on the verge of a new inauguration. There is no one alive today who remembers the last time we had a president who had non-consecutive terms, but we are headed for that. And so it's a particularly interesting situation. Now, the conference today was chaired by our Holbrooke Fellow, Michael Kimmage, who is to my right, professor of history at the Catholic University in Washington, D.C., non-resident fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Can I talk about your next gig too? And will be the head of the Kennan Center, which focuses on Russia, U.S.-Russia relations at the Wilson Center in Washington. Michael has been beyond an exemplary fellow here at the Academy. I think he's been out giving a talk almost every other night while he's here. And when he wasn't speaking, he was finishing articles that have appeared in the German, Czech, and other press, right? So we had a terrific group today. I'm going to let Michael talk more about it in a moment, but we had the deputy director of the policy planning staff from Washington. Many of you were no doubt expecting to see Anna Sauerbrei from Die Zeit. Unfortunately, she had to be called away to deal with the crisis in Syria and the reporting requirements for her paper. So I'm delighted to say that we have Hanna Notte sitting in. Hanna is at the I always think of it just as Monterey, but in fact it is. She is the director of Eurasia Nonproliferation Program, the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, which is at Monterey, and the center. She's also a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So Hanna gets the biggest of all Bundesverdienstkreuz today because she just flew in from Bahrain and we impressed her into service. If she passes out in the middle, it'll be terrible. But she is an expert on Russia and Russian foreign policy and Russian global activities. And so because the transatlantic relationship is not only shaped by people on those two sides of the Atlantic that are close to each other, but also by Russia in its own way. She's a perfect person to have here. And she also has a terrific article in today's New York Times that she can tell you a bit about, having to do with Russia's recent experience in Syria. We had representation from European Command here in Germany, in Stuttgart. The civilian deputy of EUCOM is here. We had the ambassador from Ukraine. We had another Ukrainian scholar who's still here, I believe, Timofey Milovanov, who's a former minister in Kyiv. We had all kinds of interesting people around the table. And to my left, we had, among those interesting people around the table, we had Will Ruger. Will is right now the president of the American Institute for Economic Research. he is a man of uncommon intelligence because he lives in the wonderful town of Great Barrington, Massachusetts, somehow managed to find a way to do serious intellectual work in the hinterland, which is terrific. And Will is also a well-known individual from Washington, where he was involved in, what was the formal name of it?
Stand Together.
Stand Together.
Yes.
Wow, that's what a great name. And was involved in supporting all kinds of interesting work in foreign policy studies and security studies and the like. So we've had a great discussion. I think I'll just try to set the scene a little bit by saying that we had an election just a few weeks ago that has led Politico, one of the foremost publications in the United States, to headline its main magazine story this week, "The End of the Modern Era." As I said this morning, I always thought modernity started with the Enlightenment. Politico seems to think it started around 1941. But the key thesis there is that an America that saw itself as being really a global hegemon that was involved in upholding a set of rules of the road for the global community, and that was really, as they would say in German, tonangebend, really had the first opinion. The first was a major shaper of the rules of the trading world, of the universe of security. That era has passed with the re-election of Donald Trump, and so that has caused all kinds of discussion. A great German historian, Henry August Winkler, said it's a particularly precarious moment in global affairs. So is this or is this not true? That is what we came together to discuss. Among the biggest concerns for Europeans, certainly at this moment, are what will the new administration do about Ukraine and what will it do about trade? Because President-elect Trump has spoken on many occasions about his desire to institute a serious regime of tariffs that would really change, or I should say, continue and elaborate some of the changes that he instituted in his first term of office, and that the Biden administration continue, but that really represent a departure from the post-Cold War kind of consensus on how we would trade with one another. So without any more palaver from me, I'm going to turn it over to Michael, who can summarize a bit about where we are on the Ukraine issue and what outcomes we might expect after January 20th, or what new processes, developments we might expect.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan, for the introduction, and thanks to all here at the American Academy for making this day possible. This day, a very stimulating conversation, and it's of course a great pleasure to be with you this evening for the public event. By way of synthesis, what I'd like to do is to share with you one generalization that I extracted from today's conversation and two open questions. I'll confess that we didn't resolve all the questions that came up in the course of the day, so some of them are still open, and I'll share two of those with you this evening. The generalization that I personally feel somewhat confident making, given all that's not easy to predict about the coming administration in the U.S., is that Washington is going to take a new approach to the war in Ukraine when Trump comes to office, and that it's going to be, if not quite a policy shift, it's going to be a conceptual shift from a war which, if Kamala Harris had been elected, would have been approached in the spirit of 2025 being a build year and plans being afoot for a offensive or counteroffensive on the part of Ukraine, with the goal still of Ukraine gaining all of its 1991 territory back, or at least 2022, pre-February 2022 territory back. That, I think, would have been the mentality in Washington had Kamala Harris been elected. Under President Trump, I think it's quite clear that that will not be the reigning mentality, but there will be a more defensive conceptualization of the war, perhaps with the current line of contact as sort of understood to be a semi-permanent line of contact, that's a bit harder to say. But I think a counteroffensive for the Trump administration is not only something that they wouldn't wish to pay for, it's something that they don't want to see happen, because they have a sort of a different strategic and diplomatic approach to the war from the current administration in Washington. So will that change everything? No. Has this situation arrived to a degree by default already on the battlefield? I think it's possible to say yes to that, but it is going to be a new U.S. position. Just make one further point here under the rubric of this generalization. What I also took from today's conversation is that this is not in and of itself a catastrophe for Ukraine, that Ukraine can live with the war as a war that becomes somewhat more defensive in nature. But for Ukraine, this heightens the question of what kind of security guarantee is going to be given. So if roughly 20% or a bit less or a bit more of Ukrainian territory is going to remain de facto under a permanent Russian occupation, what does that mean for the 80% that is not? And there must be, from Ukraine's perspective, a very strong and sustained commitment to the defense of this territory, but also beyond that, whether that's NATO membership or something equivalent, a security guarantee that makes this territory defensible for the long term. But there's a psychological element that there's also the need for investment. And the point that came up also today is that for Ukrainian entrepreneurs and business folk, to stay in the country means to see some kind of horizon with the war. And so a security guarantee or strong degrees of commitment to Ukraine could provide that horizon. And again, this doesn't amount to an end to the war, but perhaps a new phase. And if there is a proper degree of commitment to Ukraine on the part of the US and Europe, this may be an outcome or a shift with which Ukraine can live. So that's the first generalization, or that's the only generalization that I'll offer. And we'll now shift to two open questions. The first open question is about economic statecraft and where Europe and the US are going to go, where the transatlantic relationship is going to go when President Trump comes to office. And Will, I think there was a bit of, not quite disagreement, but there were a few different opinions about this, and I wouldn't want to put words in your mouth, so disagree with me if I get it wrong. But I think, Will, what you argued is that there will be changes. There's going to be greater use of economic statecraft on the part of the U.S. to articulate and promote American interests, even if that involves stepping on the toes of Europeans. But for reasons of sustaining American economic growth, this is going to go only so far. That there will be, sort of a threshold, and beyond that threshold, President Trump is not going to go. And I think that that's, of course, a very defensible viewpoint, but the other viewpoint did come up at the table that this may lead to a kind of spiraling set of economic and political tensions between Europe and the United States. And so I would simply want to offer as an open question the question of what that would mean for support for Ukraine. So in particular, since we are in Berlin, we're in Germany, if there is a very high degree of tension between Berlin and Washington on matters of trade and commerce and what the rules of the economic road are, will it be possible for these two countries to cooperate, sort of effectively and meaningfully on supporting Ukraine? Going back to that first point, that for Ukraine to see a horizon in the war, they need a high degree of sustained commitment. I myself don't have an answer to the question. Will, I think you may be entirely right that there will be a kind of choppy period at the beginning, and then things will stabilize. I think that does conform in a way to the story of Trump administration number one. But if it is a different scenario, I think it does raise key and important questions about the course of transatlantic support for Ukraine. Finally, this was at the margins of our discussion. I don't think we ever got fully into it, but the final open question is about European unity with a new government in Washington. And I think the Biden administration has bent over backwards. This is something that came up in the course of the conversation, using the word sacred to describe the U.S. commitment to NATO, or perhaps at times even the transatlantic relationship, that the U.S. has bent over backwards to keep Europe on board with the war in Ukraine and on other issues. And under the Biden administration, I think the U.S. has seen itself explicitly as a balancing factor within Europe. So there's a different threat perception in Estonia for the war in Ukraine than there is in Austria, and there's a different threat perception in Austria than there is in Portugal. And I think the Biden administration has used its diplomatic tools to try to keep Europeans on one page in this regard. And the absence of a lot of commercial and economic friction has perhaps contributed to that dynamic. Is that going to remain the same? Is it possible that with a new administration in Washington, you'll see a new set of dynamics within Europe where it's possible perhaps that there could be a kind of fragmentation within Europe. And, different entities and groups within Europe, one can kind of imagine a three-part structure, perhaps Baltic Republic, Scandinavia as one part, sort of Germany, France, and UK as another part, and then Southern Europe as a third part. And all of these would be somewhat separate entities. If that does come to pass, I think it's the same question about whether there's a lot of US-German friction. Is that going to be effective in terms of supporting Ukraine in sustaining its war effort? And so the question of European unity did come up, and it's one that I want to pose again this evening because we didn't fully answer it in the course of today's discussion. So that's it for me. One generalization, two open questions.
So can I just follow up, because I think for many people who followed the press, followed the discussions of Ukraine during the campaign, many people could have come to the conclusion that the commitment to Ukraine would actually go off a cliff with the inauguration, that in fact the president-elect has not been supportive of this conflict, and that we would actually essentially see a switch flipped. Why do you think that's not the case?
I think there are a few reasons why that's. I think there are a few reasons why that's not the case. One goes back to the rhetoric that Trump has used to approach the question of Ukraine, that he presents himself as a deal maker, as he often does in many international and domestic political situations. I think if you're a deal maker in the situation, you don't give away your leverage at the beginning, so you wouldn't withdraw at the beginning. You would attempt to make a deal, and if that doesn't work out, you kind of go to the next phase of action. So I think that's that's one factor. I think campaigning is different from governing. There are all kinds of real life consequences that would come from an abrupt withdrawal of U.S. Support, and I think that those would weigh heavily on the minds of Trump administration figures. And then there's also, going back to Trump's rhetoric, one of the ways in which President Trump or President-elect Trump has been critical of Joe Biden when it comes to the war in Ukraine, a kind of explanation for why the war begins in the first place is that Joe Biden was not tough enough. He sort of wasn't strong enough, and I think that too will be a part of President Trump's self-image when he comes to power, that he's not going to want to be perceived as weak. So there too, I think a kind of unilateral, abrupt withdrawal of support just doesn't make sense. It doesn't mean that support will not diminish. I think that's very conceivable. It doesn't mean that support couldn't perhaps stop, but if that is the case, I think that would be in year 3 or year 4 of the Trump administration, after a lot of other things that would have to be worked through to get to that point. So I just can't imagine from the beginning that we would get a 180-degree reversal of policy.
Okay, so Will, you played an absolutely essential role today in speaking in with authoritative speculation, I would say. Would that be a good way of describing it, about what the new administration would do? You made a lot of really important points about personnel is policy, that a lot will depend on who actually winds up in the key jobs and the chemistry between those different people. We don't expect you to tell us exactly what's going to happen, but what, broadly speaking, do you think will happen on these two key issues that Michael's brought up?
Yeah, well, thank you for the American Academy to have me here. It was a great workshop today, and I think what I said about those issues that Michael just brought up, I think, is that I think, unlike the previous administration, I think that President Trump and his administration will, and forgive the phrase, the slogan, but I think it means something, will put American interests first. In a way, you could say, like Pat Buchanan talked about, American interests first, second, and third when it comes to economics and security issues. And so what I think that means is that there will be, I think, more pressure from Washington to make sure that the United States isn't played as Uncle Sucker, which is a perception, a lot on the right, that has been a problem with American foreign policy in the past, is that the United States is either fine with it because it's part of a kind of more internationalist approach, or is unwittingly, being kind of played the fool, if you will. And I think that what President Trump will bring is a kind of strength to America's approach to the world, which is not isolationist. This is a red herring by critics of America First, but a view that America's actions, America's policies, they have to support all Americans in the sense. And so that our policies towards both trade and towards, say, alliance commitments or engagement abroad using military power, they have to be connected for the United States to be safe, to be prosperous, and if you will, to be great again. And I think that the theory of the case that those on the right have is that American foreign policy hasn't been working for all Americans. Now, what's interesting is that this is also something that you had seen rhetorically in some parts of Washington with the notion that we need a foreign policy for the middle class. This is something that you heard. I'm not sure it was delivered upon, but I think this notion, again, that our policies can't just work for those that are closely connected to Washington, or for elites, or for even Wall Street. Now, I do think that the president cares about overall prosperity of Americans, and I think that means that obviously it would want to be strongly supportive of a positive business climate, for a trade policy that works to support American prosperity, and a security policy that is strong. I mean, again, the President Trump is not a pacifist. He's not a non-interventionist in the sense. I think he's a realist in this regards, right? So in the first administration, there was the strike on Soleimani, clearly not a pacifist action, but also
the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's senior officer,
right.
Right.
But also, I think a proper care in making sure that American power would only be used when it really made sense, a kind of prudentialism, a realism. So, for example, there was a lot of pressure on Iran. Iran is a state that creates instability in the Middle East, and there was a lot of pressure by the administration on Iran. But you also saw it in which you did not see. You saw some tit-for-tat strikes, but you didn't see a full-on conflict. And in fact, the first Trump administration saw the end of America's longest war in our history, the forever war of Afghanistan, that President Trump started the process for that to end with the Doha Agreement. And so you have, I think, a very, like I said, America first, second, and third president. And if you look at, again, precedents, I think history is a guide. Michael talked about the issue of trade. President Trump had criticisms of NAFTA. What you saw with the replacement of NAFTA wasn't a kind of full-on trade war that ended in the end of trade and autarky in America. Instead, you got what I think the administration believed was a better deal for America. And some of that meant like some trade liberalization around dairy with Canada, and other times it meant certain types of things that Mexico had to do to satisfy some of the concerns about manufacturing and the effect of NAFTA on American manufacturing. So, again, I think that those precedents suggest that President Trump will be a prudentialist president, a realist, if you will. And that, again, it doesn't mean the stereotype of isolationism, that's a red herring, or of, but he's certainly also not someone who is, like the butcher's dog that wants to go to war constantly. I mean, you just don't hear that type of language. And you saw that in the, I thought, really interesting tweet that he had, or it was on Truth Social first, about Syria. Talking about a very different language than you've traditionally heard from, I think, Washington about events in the Middle East. He was essentially saying, like, look, this isn't our fight. That's very different than talking about red lines in Syria, or where are the carriers, which is the kind of constant cliched refrain from Washington, that when something bad happens in the world, the first question people ask is, where are the carriers? What I love about President Trump is it seems to be that his first question is, what's our dog in the fight, right? Like, do we have a dog in the fight? What are American interests? Not, where are the carriers? And I think that's a great sign for the future of American foreign policy, and why I think that the America First approach will be good for the United States. A big question, and maybe for the rest of the panel, is, what does this look like for Europe? What does it look like for Ukraine? Because the devil will be in the details of how it sorts out. But from the American perspective, I think the people in Des Moines are going to be happy that he's going to care more about Des Moines than he is for Brussels.
Okay. So I want to bring Hanna in here now, and again, thank her for sticking around when she'd probably rather be getting in bed early. But Hanna, tell us. I want to get to your op-ed, but I'm curious first if you'd speak a bit about what we've learned thus far from the Russian reaction to Trump's election, and how they're viewing a Trump second administration.
I think the evidence is ambivalent in terms of how the Russians are looking at the incoming Trump administration. On the one hand, I think there was a realization in Moscow that if Kamala Harris is elected, there would be a continuation of the previous or the Biden administration policy, and therefore no prospect for a deal, probably. Now there is that notion that a deal, potentially even favorable to Russia, might be possible with a Trump administration. But I think, on the other hand, there's also this sense of unpredictability that one has with Trump, right? That one is not entirely sure what one is going to get with this guy. And coupled with that, I would say what you also hear from Russian commentators is this notion that there was a lot of expectation when Trump came in the first time, and then actually Russia-US relations did not improve all that much, and there were certain expectations that were not met. And so I think, I'm not able to look into Putin's mind and sort of predict how he's going to look at this, but I think there's a certain ambivalence on the Russian side, a wait and see.
So that is really interesting. And then would it be correct to say that the preferred Russian outcome was essentially a deadlock, a real electoral mess in the U.S., unclarity for weeks, if not months, about who had won, potential of civil violence as a result? Was that what they were hoping for?
I think that's fair to say, because it would reinforce the Russian narrative that the West is in decline, right, that the United States is in decline. It would, add nicely to this broader Russian narrative on the West. And so I think that's something that they might have hoped for.
And there have been some strange remarks and utterances from Moscow that are really kind of hard to interpret. Like, supposedly President-elect Trump spoke with Putin, with Elon Musk on the line, and then the Russians just said, no, it never happened. What do we make of that?
I think that kind of confused messaging coming out of Moscow is not unprecedented. We see it right now as well after the fall of Assad, when there appears to be maybe a lack of strategic guidance from the Kremlin in terms of how something that is happening should be framed or should be talked about by different parts of the Russian government. And so I think that might have been an instance of that.
The old communication screw up. So,
when the Prigozhin mutiny happened, that was, I'm not saying that this is comparable to a phone call, but, I'm just saying that we've seen several instances of this over the past few years where the initial messaging out of Moscow was ambivalent.
So today you've written that Putin just got a severe defeat, and you wrote this in the New York Times. Do you want to explain what the events in Syria mean for Vladimir Putin and for Russia?
Sure. I mean, if you allow me, maybe I'll take a step back and sort of look at Russia's global foreign policy for a second before I come to Syria specifically to provide some context, because I think it's really important. You know, we're so focused now in our transatlantic debate about the possibility of a ceasefire on Ukraine, which to me, looking at Russia's global foreign policy, would unlikely solve the strategic problem that we have with Russia. Because we have a Russia that is not just concerned with this or that territorial configuration in Ukraine or Ukrainian NATO membership or the absence thereof. We are confronted with a Russia that has a different vision for a new European security architecture or order, which was very clearly articulated by the Russian side prior to the invasion of Ukraine. And I would go further than that and say we are actually confronted with a Russia that seeks a revision of global order, that looks at global order and says the rules of the game have been fundamentally stacked against us. We've had it, and we now see an opportune moment to change the rules of the game. And so if you look at Russia's global foreign policy, it is essentially recalibrated to pursue that fundamental confrontation with the West. Russia has oriented its economic relations towards the East and towards the South in order to secure lifelines for its economy and defense enterprise in order to be able to pursue a long war. It is championing multilateral diplomacy in fora that explicitly exclude the West. If we look at the BRICS, for example, which is a forum that the Russians have been chairing this year and have been very, very active. And we see a Russian global foreign policy that is essentially confrontational now vis-à-vis the West in each and every sphere. Even spheres like nuclear arms control or nuclear non-proliferation, preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, those were policy spheres in which through the last years and decades, Russia and Western countries were still able to cooperate even as relations were deteriorating. That has now pretty much fallen by the wayside. And so because of these changes in Russian foreign policy, we are now also in a situation in Ukraine, and I think this is something the transatlantic relationship also has to deal with, where the war is becoming increasingly globalized. Because we are sitting here today, and Russia is using North Korean troops in order to prosecute that war. I mean, who would have thought that this is conceivable a year ago? Where Iranian drones were procured by Russia, and now Russia is producing those very drones on its own soil, and they're raining down on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure on a day-to-day basis. So a totally new dimension for us to deal with. Now I want to come to Syria to make the point that it's not like Russia is not facing any limitations in pursuing this confrontational global foreign policy. I think you can make a convincing argument that the decision that appears to have been taken a few days ago by the Russians to drop Bashar al-Assad after many years, in fact decades, of investment in this relationship with the Assad family and political and military investment in propping him up, that this is a story about capacity constraints on the Russian side. So I think, were the Russians also frustrated with Assad and at some point sort of, had it with him? Yes, possible. Were the dynamics unfolding at such speed last week? And then there was this realization that the Syrian armed forces weren't really fighting and that the Iranians weren't coming either. And that one then just had to make a decision to cut one's losses and to let Assad fall. Yes, I think that's also very much part of the story. But I think the capacity constraints that Russia has because Ukraine is its utmost foreign policy priority and its resources are in high demand there, I think is still part of the explanation. So what does it mean for Putin now? I think it's somewhat early to tell. I would caution against the notion that the Russians are now completely out of Syria. We see Russia now negotiating to potentially retain its bases on the Mediterranean coast, so the airbase in Khmeimim and the port in Tartus, which are critical to Russian power projection in Africa, which I see as a new frontier for Russian foreign policy. They're very active now in the Sahel, in Libya. That's of concern to us Europeans as well. Russia doesn't want to lose that power projection, so they'll try to negotiate and they'll try to find a way, I think, to retain those bases. But notwithstanding this, I think this is a defeat for Putin reputationally, because as much as he was loathed in the region for standing with Bashar al-Assad, it also earned him some sort of respect, with strongmen in the region who thought, we don't like the fact that he's saving Assad, but he's standing with his ally. He's a loyal ally to Bashar al-Assad, whereas the Americans, are not always so reliable. That is at least the perception, whether rightly or wrongly, in part of the region. And now I think that reputation is in jeopardy. And I also think that Russia is, as a result of Assad being gone, losing some leverage vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis Turkey. And of course, one big result of the developments in the Middle East ever since the Hamas attack on October 7th of last year is that we now see Iran, Russia's partner, probably at its weakest in decades. And so I think the strategic bottom line for Russia in the Middle East today is less favorable than it was a year ago.
And can I just follow up by saying, the fourth member that hasn't been mentioned of this axis of upheaval is China, and one would imagine that from the setbacks that have happened with the Syrians and the Iranians, the implication is the Russians will be depending even more on the Chinese. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yeah, I think if we look at what's commonly labeled nowadays the axis of upheaval, so Russia's partnership with China, North Korea, and Iran, the dependence on China and what China means for the Russian economy, also in terms of Russia's ability to import dual-use goods, which go into its defense enterprise, it is by far the most significant. And I think economically, the Russians are going to become more and more dependent on the Chinese over the medium to long term. So, in terms of direct battlefield support, perhaps Iran and North Korea have been more consequential. But China is, I think, in a different league of its own. And so, yes, I think it's fair to say that perhaps that relationship will become even more important. Because I think what the Iranians can do for Russia over the short to medium term, given the simultaneity of conflict in the Middle East and Iran having to reconstitute its capabilities and dealing with an aggressive Israel that wants to deal with the Iranian threat, there's perhaps less that Iran can do for Russia, at least over the short to medium term.
So since we're talking about China, Will, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to kind of inform us about in the broad contours of Republican thinking about China as a new administration comes in. Many of us have worked with the European Council on Foreign Relations. They did a terrific set of articles about the different tribes of Republicans in the foreign policy world. So no prediction will be very useful, but why don't you give us the common denominators here about thinking about China, and if you have any thoughts about what we might see in the first 6 months, then I'd like to hear that.
I think a lot of Republicans, I think, rightly draw the conclusion, looking at the nature of the world today, that China is our most important strategic challenge, and that means that there will have to be prioritization. And I think prioritization is kind of part of that prudentialist, realist approach that I think a lot of Republicans clamor for in a world in which too often there's been an idealism, a reliance on a kind of form of liberal internationalism, and we'd like to see greater prioritization and prudentialism. And so what that means is that it means that for Europe, I think there's a real sense of a desire for greater burden sharing and burden shifting to our European allies and partners. And there's been a lot of talk about this probably since the origin of NATO, right? But I think that it seems more real this time because Americans have frequently talked about the importance of burden sharing, talked about the importance of maybe Europe being more autonomous, but then it's been schizophrenic and oftentimes hasn't actually wanted them to do it when they tried and then complained about it when they didn't. I think there's a more, serious sense in which if the United States is going to prioritize both not just China, but also domestic politics, and I think that's underrated by foreign policy people because we think about what's outside of our shores. But I think for a lot of Americans, it's, okay, how do we put American domestic priorities first? And not just American domestic priorities, but also things in the Western Hemisphere. How do we deal with issues in Mexico, in Latin America? Aren't those more important than figuring out, who's going to school in Helmand Province, Afghanistan? And to be honest, I think it's ripe for that, because what happens in Mexico, what happens in Venezuela, these are more important ultimately for the everyday lives of Americans than often what's happening in many parts of the world that are, you could argue that no thing is completely irrelevant to America because we're a global power, but are certainly a lot less relevant than, say, even something like the fentanyl crisis or immigration crisis. Those things are going to, I think, take the fore. But then when it does go outside of the Americas, China. And that also means that the Middle East is going to be different. And I do think that Republicans are very strongly supportive of Israel. But I think for some other things in the region, there's a big question about what role they will play. I mean, obviously, in the first administration, you saw the end of our forever war. There's a lot of people that would like to see the United States reduce its footprint, be more of what you might call an offshore balancer, which would probably be an approach to the Middle East that would allow for greater prioritization of China. Because one thing that is frustrating to a lot of realists about American foreign policy is a lack of thinking, or at least less thinking, about trade-offs. And so when we talk about the importance of China, well, what are the trade-offs? I mean, this even relates to kind of where the rubber hits the road when it comes to like artillery shells, when it comes to other types of munitions. If the United States is providing those, and again, there are some things that are more relevant to Europe and less relevant to, say, the issue of Taiwan, but there are real trade-offs. And to me, that's kind of where we need to go in foreign policy in America generally. And I think that that's a strongly held view among a lot of conservatives, particularly younger conservatives. And that's one thing I wanted to mention. I think that's important for European audiences to hear, is that there's a difference between kind of millennial and Gen Z views on the nature of America's role in the world than, say, boomers. And I think you see that. I mean, look at some of the people that have been nominated in the Trump administration. Tulsi Gabbard, J.D. Vance, Matt Gaetz when he was put up for Attorney General, Pete Hegseth at DOD. These are people with different generational experiences than some of the people that have kind of remained more sympathetic to the, if not the George W. Bush approach in practice, the kind of the theory of George W. Bush's approach to foreign policy.
Yeah.
And so I would expect more changes if we think the generational experiences of like Iraq, which was a debacle and had a real impact on younger Americans, particularly those who had to fight. There was a big article in the newspaper recently in America, I think it was the Times, maybe it was the Journal, just about the experience in Iraq that those veterans like Tulsi, Pete Hegseth, and J.D. Vance had, and how that has an impact. And I think that's something we have to think about when it comes to the next generation of leaders, because they're very different than, say, H.W. Bush or others that were kind of formed in the crucible of the World War II experience or in the Cold War experience. Very different, I think, sense of what that means. And so it means that 2003, it might not replace 1938 in the kind of historical analogies, but it's certainly now rivaling 1938.
Mm-hmm. I just want to tell you I'm troubled by the continual denigration of boomers, but we'll move on.
Let's just talk. It was just an analytical point, not a normative one.
Yeah. Point taken. So we'll get. I want to open it up to the audience in just 1 minute, but Michael, I thought I'd ask you, and I'm sorry if this is throwing a curveball, what you think about, from what we know thus far, the prioritization of China, the particular approach to China means for the transatlantic relationship. So I think it's at this point widely accepted that of all the issues out there, the differences on China between the outgoing administration and the incoming administration were probably the narrowest of those in the various contested fields of policy. But I'm curious, from your time here at the Academy, from your discussions with lots of Germans and lots of other Europeans, if you see China coming down the pike as a big issue of contention.
I'm not entirely sure. I think that it's, of course, a interesting and dramatic narrative. It's an interesting and dramatic journalistic narrative, but I'll, in a way, play devil's advocate to the premise of your question, Dan, with the following point, that you have a series of administrations really going back to the Obama administration that, in theory, have said that the key challenge is China, and this is going to determine the main lines of American foreign policy, and it's going to be the thing that determines prioritization and military budgets and all of that. And that's, of course, not an unimportant storyline. There was the pivot to Asia under Obama, and that was a real thing with real diplomatic consequences. And there certainly has been a shift, over the last 20 years, where issues related to China, security issues related to China, have become more prominent. And then under Biden, of course, technology questions and natural resources. And you could say that Trump kind of won the argument about China when he came to power in 2017, and that the Biden administration, as you suggested, Dan, has sort of continued along those lines. But you have all of that in the background, and yet, almost going back to 1945 or earlier, you can say all of that, but somehow Europe seems to take precedent in terms of the crises of the day, the kind of central theater of contestation. And so that's not what the Obama administration asked for, but when Crimea was annexed in late February, early March of 2014, that's what they got, a major crisis in Europe. And so that really dominated the last 2 years of the Obama second term, that plus, Middle East, Syria, even back then. I don't know if that's exactly the story of the first Trump term, but, China, China, China. But two countries enter the NATO alliance under Trump, lethal military assistance to Ukraine, and U.S. military spending and troop presence in Europe under Trump go up. They don't go down. So, even there you have a sort of theoretical shift, but in practice, Europe becomes, in effect, more important as a theater of action or of contestation. But it's certainly true for the Biden administration. And that came up today when the deputy director of the policy planning staff noted a kind of accusation that has been made of the Biden people, that they wish to park Russia at the beginning of their term to deal with the pandemic on the one hand, and to plan for competition or antagonism with China on the other. And yet, what do they get, sort of a year into their first term, but a massive war in Europe that has completely dominated, I would say, Biden administration strategic thinking. So I'm not sure if it's always a choice that Washington gets to make. In some ways, the world can make the choice too, and maybe to the misfortune of Europe, that choice is often made in the context of a crisis or now a war. And I wouldn't be that surprised if that pattern would repeat itself in Trump too. I mean, you can say that we want to wrap up the war in Ukraine. You can say that there are issues of restraint and limitation, and those may all play an important role. And the focus, the kind of gaze, may go to the Indo-Pacific and to China. But there are 100 ways in which the war in Ukraine could get so much worse, or just become so much more of a severe problem. And then the Trump White House is going to have to respond and deal with that. And I would guess, Will, you may disagree on this point, but if the war intensifies, my guess is that the resource commitment to Ukraine under Trump is going to go up. And so you would see a trend line, sort of, Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump, that goes in one direction of actually increased commitment to Europe. So not sure if that is entirely true, but I'll make that point as the devil's advocate.
Well, high points for being contrarian. So it also reminds me that when the Obama administration first came up with the pivot to Asia, I remember one of the architects of the pivot saying, we're just completely stuck in the Middle East and we got to get out and pivot to Asia. And here we are again. I guess it's a version of Trotsky. You may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you. So on that note, why don't we open it up to the crowd? And please do raise your hand and make sure there's a question mark at the end of the question.
The Jeopardy rule.
Yeah, that's right. Oh my God, it's all been said already. Yes, finally, there's a great volunteer.
Well, Heinrich Kreft, I'm used to be a German diplomat until 3 months ago. I'm now at the Istanbul Policy Center. I have a question on China. I was in China 10 days ago, participating in the China CE think tank summit, and China is making a huge effort to divide Europe. So there were 60 think tankers from Eastern Europe, and China apparently is also trying to get compromises on the e-vehicle issue with the Commission. My question is, we have seen the tariffs on China led to a deviation of trade of steel to Europe. Then we got tariffs on aluminium and steel from the US. But for Europe, particularly for Germany, there's much more at stake with China because we are much more invested in China. Our trade with China is much more important. So, and we are already growing to a much lower rate than the US is doing, than China is doing, and Germany is in recession. So losing China, losing the Chinese market would be devastating for us. And we fear that there could be something like, are you with us or against us on China? Is this a realistic scenario?
So that was exactly where I was going with the question I put to you. But maybe we should give you an option to answer that question.
I mean, I guess what I would say is, look, the United States is one of your oldest and most important allies. You should favor us. And I think the United States should want you to favor us because that puts American interests first, second, and third. And I mentioned it earlier today, actually, this issue of linkage between security and economics. And so one question I think you have is, if European countries want to play both sides against each other, or to try to get the best deal possible for itself, then should you be surprised if Americans are play more hardball too in trying to on other issues? Especially when it comes to the fact that the United States is underwriting European security. Now, some of it is because of American interests. Some of it is because of institutions we've created and so forth. But again, reciprocity of our love, I think it should be appreciated, and
vice versa.
Well, I think Americans have been very great to Europe over the last 7 decades.
But to take this a step further and contextualize, there's a whole continuum of different verbs that have been created for changing the trade relationship with China. And we had a vigorous discussion earlier today about the likelihood of actual decoupling, or the kind of de-risking that would throw the China market overboard, essentially. What are the prospects of that, do you think?
I mean, that's a really hard question to answer.
Mm-hmm.
I guess these are some of the variables, some of the factors that will go into this, which would be, one, how do you deal with tech theft? How do you deal with IP protection? How do you deal with labor issues in China? How do you deal with a balance of trade that's not on the right side according to the future administration, versus what impact would something like decoupling have on general prosperity on Wall Street. And I think that there are a lot of different interests in American politics where the arrows will go different ways on that. Mm-hmm. And so I think predictions are hard, especially about the future, as Yogi Berra said. But I think you could speculate that even if decoupling were desired, decoupling in practice would be very challenging and undesirable in certain areas, even if it were desirable for others. And so I think that the next decade, because I won't even say, just in the immediate, the next decade will be very interesting, especially on this issue, which is, and this was raised by some people today, and I think is a valuable thing to raise always when it comes to China, is what's the future of China? So on one trajectory, China rebounds, and it grows. It continues to grow. It continues to develop and spend more money on its military, and becomes a more of a near peer competitor in Asia, threatening American interests in the region. That's going to have an impact on policy in Washington that would be very different than if you see Japan 2.0, but in China, right? In the sense of, Japan went through this period where, you guys remember that book, The Coming War with Japan?
Yeah.
Okay. I missed it. Right?
The war.
Yeah. Now, again, history is not going to repeat itself necessarily, because I don't know which trajectory it's going to be. There's a lot of factors, but the graying of the Chinese population, the effects of the one child policy, the malinvestment. I mean, one of the things we should have learned from intelligence estimates of the future of the Soviet Union is that massive malinvestment by collectivist planning leads to really bad economic results that undermines the power of that state, both on the military and the economic side. There's been massive malinvestment in China. So is their economy actually going to produce? And I have a lot of faith in the Western system, which seems much superior at creating economic power, which is the golden goose for creating military power. And I do believe that the Trump administration is going to make America great again, in the sense of unleashing some of America's economic power that I think has been constrained. You see this with Elon Musk and Doge and Vivek. You see it with a desire to unleash Chris Wright, who's the nominee to be the head of Department of Energy, unleashing America's energy sector even more. So I'm kind of bullish on our economy, and that means that will help us with some of our own challenges, like the $36 trillion in debt that we're at. And I'll leave you with this. Admiral Mike Mullen, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, years ago was asked, what is the greatest national security threat to the United States? And I think most people, myself included, would have said something like China. Maybe you say terrorism, Iran. Who'd say terrorism? Right. You would have at some point, right? Mm-hmm. But the point is that you had, one of the most senior American military officials. His answer was our national debt and deficit. He didn't say something outside of the United States. He said something about America's economics. And I think he was smart, because he explained how this whole point about our economy being the golden goose, that has an effect on our military and security realm. So we have to be great when it comes to our economics in order to be so great on the military side in the long run. And so I think that also means that if China's economy can't deliver, then China's going to have also a difficult time keeping up with America, which is really the pace setter, even still, when it comes to our military power.
Next question. Right here, and then we'll go all the way in the back. First up here.
Yeah, I have one question to Mr. Kimmage and Mr. Ruger. What is the economic concept of the Trump administration, or the people coming into office to bring prosperity to the U.S. and while we're facing platform economies and a very uneven distribution of income and wealth. Because when you say, and I agree with you, that economic aspects are a matter of security, where's the idea, where's the concept, where's the vision to change that? Because America cannot and will not be acting against Europe, against China, against the Middle East, against maybe with India, I don't know, and against Russia, neither economically and especially not militarily.
I'll confess I don't feel very well prepared to answer that question in terms of my own expertise. As to how the Trump administration plans to deal with inequality, I simply don't know. I mean, I think that there is a kind of vision of restoring manufacturing and reconfiguring global economic relations so that they help the American working class, but the practicalities of that are a bit beyond me. One part where I think it's clear the Trump administration is going to try, with effects to be determined, is, of course, deregulation within the United States, tax cuts for corporate America, and especially deregulation where the energy industry is concerned. And that's a big difference, of course, between Republicans and Democrats. And so climate change and environmental concerns are often paramount with Democrats, and there's a very different approach on the part of the Trump team. I presume with the assumption that the more energy the U.S. produces at lower cost, the better it is for the American economy. But how to link that to U.S. grand strategy and a possible trade war with China or a possible trade war with the United States, and how that brings prosperity to the U.S. Or fights inflation or helps the American working class, I'm not able to make those connections. But the thing that leaps most readily to mind is deregulation as a tool for juicing the economy. But what you should maybe add to that point, which is not a policy question but a political question, is that the American electorate has made the choice that the Trump team is better on the economy. And I think there's maybe an aspirational desire to go back to pre-pandemic America in terms of the kind of economy that was there in Trump 1 until the pandemic. But the electorate has sort of spoken in that regard. And I think economics, obviously, there are many factors in the 2024 election, but economics is an important one. And why that's the case is, of course, just an interesting matter. But that's not policy, that's politics.
I haven't heard any pronouncements from the Trump, Vance, Musk administration on inequality. Have you?
I mean, I hear a lot about cutting wasteful government programs. Yeah. I mean, again, I think the number. I think what Michael said, that there's a lot of sense there. So I don't want to go on at length, but I do think that, unleashing entrepreneurialism, I think inexpensive energy production, these are good for all Americans, and so I think that those things will have an impact. I think they did have an impact. I mean, Michael referenced Trump 1, the pre-pandemic. The American economy was doing really well under Trump 1. And I think a big part of that was a very different approach on the margins than we had seen with the Obama administration on this.
I'm sorry, I couldn't resist the Elon dig. Sorry. In the back.
I don't work for Elon. So.
Yeah, that's good.
So thank you. My name is Yaşar Aydin. I'm from the German Institute of International and Security Affairs. After the fall of Assad, Trump tweeted, "This is not our fight. Don't get involved." How we have to take this? Shall we say campaigning is different than governing? So I'm wondering what means Trump's second term for America's role in Middle East, and more specific, what can we expect? How will the relation of Americas to Turkey, for example, in the Middle East? Thank you.
Who wants to take that first?
I can take a stab. I think in terms of priorities of a Trump administration in the Middle East, I think standing with Israel and taking care of the security of Israel will probably be the paramount priority. The big question, having just been in the Middle East this past weekend and having sort of seen the conversations there in the Gulf Arab states, for instance, the big question that people are asking themselves is, what are the Israelis going to do vis-a-vis Iran at this point when Iran is weak? Its proxy network has been dismantled with Hamas and Hezbollah. Its missile capability has been significantly degraded by the Israeli airstrikes on October 26th. Might there be a golden window of opportunity to deal with the Iranian nuclear program once and for all? Might Israel be tempted to conduct military strikes against Iran? That is a question that is on people's minds in the region. And related to that, the question how a Trump administration would associate with that if it were to happen after the inauguration, whether the United States would support such an approach, or whether the United States is going to try to reach a new deal with Iran, because that is sort of the other side of the expectation, that there might be a window of opportunity for a deal. That window might be short. There's been certain signaling from the Iranian side that one is willing to entertain that, a certain conciliatory rhetoric from President Pezeshkian. But then you have that coupled with further escalation by the Iranians on the nuclear front. Again, more enrichment, 60%, as just reported by the IAEA, and a changing rhetoric more generally out of Tehran in terms of the nuclear calculus over the last year. So there's not one uniform picture, but I think there's a lot of apprehension and expectation in the region regarding how Trump is going to deal with Iran and whether he's going to be able to end the war in Gaza. I mean, that is also first and foremost on the minds of certainly the Arab states. In terms of what a Trump administration might or might not do on Syria, I think it's too early to tell. It'll depend on how this post-Assad transition is going to go. And I don't think anyone can say with confidence, because we've had over 50 years of rule of the al-Assad family. It's a totally unprecedented situation now. There are certain concerns in terms of ungoverned spaces in Syria in which a resurgent Islamic State might thrive. So you can contemplate scenarios in which the United States might find itself sort of getting sucked in. And then, I don't know, then the question is to what extent the US would be willing to step up. But I think that's quite an unknown factor at this time.
I just want to bring the conversation back to Ukraine for a moment, but via the Middle East. So there is a very new factor for the Trump administration in 2025, and that's going to be the war in Ukraine. And so Iran's very, very high degree of support to Russia is in this regard consequential, right? Iran is building drone factories in Russia. It's providing Russia with very, very important forms of military assistance in Russia's war against Ukraine. And I have no doubt that the confrontational posture toward Iran that was there in Trump 1 is going to be there in Trump 2, and everything that Hanna was just describing a moment ago. You know, perhaps Israel will ratchet up tensions with Iran because they see this moment of opportunity. In that case, the Trump administration is going to be on Israel's side and not on Iran's side. And I think all of this is going to function in terms of Trump administration diplomacy toward Ukraine as a great constraint on normalizing relations with Russia because of what's happening in the Middle East and because of the connections between Iran and Russia. So I think in some ways, in terms of a peace deal with Russia or going over Ukraine's head to kind of cut a deal with Russia, it's going to be much harder for the Trump administration because of this set of relationships in the Middle East. And that's not a reality that one could have imagined between 2017 and 2021 in the first Trump term, but it's absolutely the reality of the second term. So the global implications of all of this are interesting, and they're interesting for Ukraine as well.
I would just add to that, the Prime Minister Netanyahu holds in high regard his own skills of persuasion, and he will try to persuade the incoming administration to join him in a strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. I think that Vice President-elect Vance and others have already said that was not a high priority for the new administration. But I do think, one of the open questions is, would a very pro-Israel Trump administration give Israel better bombs to do the job itself? And I think that's going to be one of the really important debates in Washington in those first few in those first few months. Anyway, did you have anything you wanted to add? Everything's been said. Okay.
Very good.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Martin Sadjan. I'm Minister Counselor of the Venezuelan Embassy here in Berlin. You started this conversation by saying that we are, there's no living person in this room that would see a president serving two non-consecutive terms. So in that regard, I would like to ask, given that President Trump, the Republican Party, has majority in both chambers of the Congress, and that the U.S. Supreme Court has a majority of Republican designated justices, do you think that American democracy has changed, or that it could lead into something different that we have not seen in the future?
Who wants to take that one?
I mean, I don't even think candidate Harris liked the autocracy democracy frame because she kind of jettisoned it, right? And so if your question is like
jettisoned and then rejoined the battle towards the end, but
yeah. How'd that work out? But I think that I think America has very strong institutions, and I think that there's a lot of desire for reform, particularly in the executive branch, by conservatives and Republicans. But I don't think it's anywhere. It's not going to be what I think that the Biden was selling at home and abroad. I mean, one of the things that you see with like Doge, for example, is cutting government. It's trying to make sure that people who are elected are making policy, not bureaucrats. So if we're trying to talk about the strength of democracy in America, things like the Supreme Court ending Chevron deference, things like trying to make sure that the people who are actually making policymaker have an electoral connection. If people talk about what's called Schedule F reform, for example, I mean, there's clearly, I think, a view among conservatives that the bureaucracy has run amok. Now, that's not to say that every part of the bureaucracy is bad or that the Republicans want to, kill every part of government. They're not anarchists. But it does. But I have a hard time understanding how a party that would like to see more empowerment of people with an electoral connection is authoritarian. Now, there are legitimate executive congressional relations issues that I think will be part of the usual scrum in Washington. And, but look, I think American democracy is actually quite robust. And, I think the American people signaled that. We were going to have a peaceful transfer of power. We had a relatively clean election. President Trump won fair and square. I don't think anybody contests that. And American institutions still support, even despite all the talk of court packing, which to me is more of a move towards executive authority over our tradition and the notion of divided powers, right? Where the executive is going to pack the court because it doesn't like what the court's saying as an independent body. That's, to me, was more troubling than things like Schedule F reform, even if it happens. So again, I have a lot of faith in America. I think America is able to continually revive itself to make. I mean, this won't be the first time we've made America great again. Ronald Reagan did that after the kind of malaise of the 70s. You've seen this continually. I'll have to put in a plug for Grover Cleveland. He is the original
and only.
The original non-consecutive term guy. We forget that this is a guy who was a kind of populist reformer who reinvented in many ways government back in the late 19th century, because there was a perception about increased corruption and the power of special interests. And Cleveland was kind of like a classical liberal populist. And so again, I have just great faith in America's ability. Our institutions are strong. Our ideals are strong. We have problems too, and we need to deal with those. But I see a lot of the things that the Trump administration does as supporting that. If you think about just like the pushback against wokeism in America by the American right, to me, that leans into Martin Luther King's argument about judging people by their merit, not the color of their skin. Hey, look, the Supreme. Yeah, thank you. I mean, the Supreme Court agreed with me in the cases of campus politics and the role of DEI on campus. Right? This notion that America should be a land of equal opportunity. And I think that again, like, you could disagree with me or not, but I see this as part of our renewal as a country. And I think elect Trump did particularly well compared to other Republicans with minority communities in America. That to me says something.
Some minority communities. Yeah. So I would just also add that the margin in the House of Representatives is going to be the narrowest in history. So, we'll see what happens. And if the president-elect keeps taking people out of the House for executive branch jobs, it's going to be really, really close. Anyway, next question. I have one over here.
I'm Stephanie Haidt-Kunze, an American in Berlin. And there have been 3 countries not mentioned in this whole discussion, and it brings it all back to Europe. And that's Poland, that's Turkey. There was a question about Turkey, but we haven't discussed it. And then Hungary. And Hungary has a much more passive, symbolic role. But these 3 countries will influence the choices the United States has. And these choices are changing every day. And so it makes me wonder, why aren't Poland and especially Turkey, which are important for Germany, not more of this discussion?
Well, you're a Europeanist. I'm happy to give it a crack, but go ahead.
Yeah, if you're happy to give it a
No,
crack.
well, I'm not that happy. So I would just say on the first one, Turkey, I don't think anyone has cracked the code on the relationship with Turkey in 25 years. And I have a feeling that the next administration will wrestle with that as the last one did. And Prime Minister Erdogan defies pretty much all efforts to be dealt with consequently and effectively. Hanna, maybe you have a view on that. Poland is a very different country from what it was in the first Trump term. And in fact, Poland's strongest voice for support for Ukraine in Europe right now, I'd say. Certainly the strongest voice from a large country, and one that is building up its military very rapidly. And as for Hungary, well, I'm going to leave Hungary to you since we discussed that earlier today. It's one country, and I will only, without citing anyone, I will just say that maybe Hungary is interesting to American conservatives because of the cultural politics dimension. It's not geopolitically that interesting, and it is probably the case, this is my judgment, that it will not be viewed as a thorn in the side of the transatlantic relationship in the way that it was during the Biden administration. Is that a fair way to put it?
I'll just, throw in one other country, since there's a long list of countries we haven't mentioned, and we'll throw in Italy. I happened to see on social media, I think it was today, a video of Meloni and Elon Musk together, I think in the last 24 hours. And I think that's going to be just an interesting story with Italy, not one that I would have an easy time predicting. But if there's maybe a bit of a shift on Ukraine policy, depending on what the messages coming from Washington. I mean, Maloney has been a pretty robust supporter of President Zelensky and in Ukraine. I would be curious to see if that would change, and if that would change, I suppose you could ask a larger question, maybe about Hungary, Slovakia, and a handful of other European countries, potentially France, if there's a change in government, if you would see a kind of new bloc in Europe emerge that would have a degree of ideological affinity and would partner with Trump's Washington in new and perhaps for Germany very provocative ways. But I would have no way of fitting Poland and Turkey into that pattern. So it's maybe more of a, again, Hungary, Slovakia, Italy, potentially France pattern.
Maybe I'll just add, I mean, I cannot speak to how the Trump administration will approach Turkey, but I don't think that the fundamental problem to the United States, which is that they have to deal with a Turkey that will also try to stay somewhat close to Russia, is going to change. I've seen a lot of commentary since the fall of Assad suggesting that this is sort of Turkey, by backing the Syrian rebels, throwing the Russians out of Syria, and it's going to lead to this big break in Russia-Turkey relations. Certain Russian ideologues taking to social media and sort of engaging in diatribes against Turkey. I think that this relationship between Putin and Erdogan will come out intact from the situation. The Russian-Turkish relationship is very complicated. It plays out in many different spheres. They're present in Syria, they're present in the South Caucasus, they're present in Libya. Russia has economic leverage over Turkey, given gas supplies and building nuclear power plants in Turkey. So there's a lot of stakes on both sides. I do think it is a relationship in which, ever since the invasion of Ukraine, the relative leverage has slowly shifted in favor of Turkey. So that means there's certain opportunities here. But I think that Russia will also always seek to navigate very cautiously vis-a-vis Turkey and not to antagonize it, because for Putin, having Turkey as a potential irritant or a Trojan horse within NATO, you know, a country that might not be always fully aligned with NATO, but that is also going to be accommodative towards Russia on certain issues, that's just such a prize to have, such an important asset. And so Russia will be concerned not to give that up, I think.
Yeah, and I think that the military relationship, or I should say the arms relationship, is not going to go away, and that will continue to be an irritant no matter who's in office in Washington. I think we have time for one last question. But I see two hands, so maybe we'll ask at least two then. I'm a softy. Yeah.
Maybe we can ask two questions. Just a general question. You described the new president as a deal maker, but what kind of thinking does he have? Is it a null-sum game, or is it a win-win situation when he pursues his deal making? Because win-win situations you can repeat, but when you make a deal in a null-sum game, one win, one lose, you will not try to repeat this.
Do you want to try that one? We can all take a bite of that one. Yeah.
Forgive a very bland answer. I mean, I think you can see, I just would base things on the first Trump administration. You can kind of see both. I don't think zero-sum thinking is foreign to President Trump. You know, in the first term, on certain trade issues, I think there was a bit of a feeling of we win, you lose, and if that's how it has to be, it has to be. But I think in ways that Will could probably articulate better than I, there was also a lot of win-win thinking as well. That you kind of give us this, we give you that. Sort of back and forth, which is pretty typical of diplomacy. The worldview that President Trump or President-elect Trump has is not an especially rosy one. You think back to the term American carnage, and a lot of the social media is rather bleak, and it's a description of a world that's a violent place, that's unruly, in which America is being pushed back on its heels, a narrative of decline that doesn't just come from Russia about the United States, but interestingly from President-elect Trump and people in his orbit. So to the degree that you have that kind of language and that kind of spirit of we're in decline, things are very difficult, there's a world of enemies, people who are out to get us, of course that inclines you more toward zero-sum than toward win-win. But I think you see examples of both.
I guess the only thing I would add is that it's very clear that the president isn't naive, and international politics is an anarchic realm in which states need to engage in self-help, if you will, right? This is the kind of standard international relations 101, and that means that there are going to be times in which there's going to be a distribution of relative gains that is going to favor one party or another. And I think all states, I mean, this is why I think we have to be careful about saying, well, this is just how the US is or how President Trump is. All states engage in some level of concern about their self-interest vis-a-vis others. And Germany is the last place that I think would say that that's not the case, because we've seen that where Germany has made certain decisions in its recent past about the relative distribution of its budget vis-a-vis security versus guns and butter, and it was a belief that those things satisfied its interest, first, second, and third, and some of the consequences were suffered by others, right? So the United States has frequently been the state that has been buck passed to, and buck passing is a strategy in international politics that is kind of win-lose in that sense, right? Because every dollar that the American taxpayer has to spend to help support European security is potentially a dollar that European taxpayers don't have to. So tell me how that isn't engaging in the same kind of self-interest. And I don't damn states for it. As a realist, I just think this is how states act, and we shouldn't be naive about it. And I think one of the great things about President Trump is he's not naive about this either. And so I think that's important.
There was one last hand right there. Okay. Final question.
Just circling back to the EU and Germany. So for the next 4 years, we will see a European Commission that's sort of alone without leadership. From France, a lame duck presidency under Macron, and from, well, we're not so sure what Merz would be on the EU. So I'd like to get a discussion on that. And secondly, maybe a bit on American democracy. There is still a perception that America is entering a second Gilded Age, where it's mostly oligarchs, billionaires, in charge of government agencies, right? And it doesn't solve the problem that there's this vast inequality in American society. You see people on the left and right cheering for the murder of the health insurance CEO recently. So
that was a question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer should be we should all be appalled by murder, and can't we all get along on that point, right?
I think undoubtedly we would agree on the point regarding the executive, although it is you are undoubtedly right that it is an interesting time in American history. We do have remarkable inequality right now. And that is certainly disturbing to some people. And it is a really interesting phenomenon, set aside the fact that it's morally dismaying that so many people are upset about the quality of their health care and the problems that they have to deal with the American healthcare system, that they have cheered on this gruesome act. And I don't have a crystal ball either, but I think that this note of hatred and resentment at the inequality, at the fact that the executive's making $10+ million a year while people are having a hard time getting their claims filled, is one that's not going to go away. And that, one of the interesting commentaries on the election, and we were talking about minorities who voted for Trump, is that many people were voting their class identity more than they were their ethnic identity. And that's a really interesting development. And then if you combine that with a class resentment along these lines, we could be in for some interesting times. Totally unpredictable, could be a red herring, could be a total one-off. Certainly a horrible act of violence, but watch this space. Yes, you can go.
I'll jump in on the question of elections and European politics. I mean, on the one hand, it seems like this is what Europe always is, right? There are always these changes, and this one is up and this one is down, and this party is kind of in, and this coalition is dissolving, and this coalition is forming. So it doesn't seem in a way especially new. And I think in Germany it's possible to exaggerate in a way how bad things are. I mean, it's going according to constitutional procedure here, and there will be a new chancellor, there will be a new government, and it will figure things out. And I think that's kind of true across the board in Europe. But rather than be too optimistic, it's always good to conclude on a pessimistic note. There's one way in which the particular configurations of these elections is exceptionally unfortunate for Europe. And this is that there will be a 3-4 month period, I suspect, where the Trump administration will seek to negotiate with Russia about the future of Ukraine, or perhaps even the future of European security. I won't comment on whether there's a high likelihood of success in this context. I'll simply say that this is likely to happen every American presidency. The president is most powerful the first month and a little bit less powerful the second month, and kind of on it goes. And so the time that it makes sense for the Trump administration to do this is, February, March, April, May. And I guess if it drags on until May, it's not so bad for Germany. But the point is, if the Trump administration comes up with a series of ideas, this should be the territorial configuration of Ukraine. This is what a security guarantee looks like. This is the kind of deal we're going to make. This is even the format of the discussions, right? Will they be held in Europe? Will they be held in Washington? Will they be held in the Middle East or on an island in the Atlantic Ocean? You would want to have a say on that as Germany, because what happens in Ukraine is going to matter probably down the road much more to Germany than it will to the United States in terms of just sheer proximity. So you have a major war in Europe, the biggest since 1945, of enormous, urgent importance to the German national interest. And the period when there will be probably the biggest diplomatic shift in the war is going to be a period in which Germany is not going to have a government, or will have a very newly formed government if one knows from German precedent that you can have the election, but maybe it will take 6 months to get a new coalition. I doubt that will be the case this time, because it just would be so self-defeating. But it's awful to contemplate that Europe will, in a sense, be not at the table at a moment when it would really matter for Europe to be at the table. So in that sense, it's sort of uniquely unfortunate.
Well, clearly he's had a great fellowship if he wants to end on a pessimistic note, and we're thrilled with that. So ordinarily at this point, I would tell you the next 6 events we're going to do. I'm not going to do that because this is the last event of the semester. And I am pleased that we are at least going out on a note in which we're fulfilling our mission of explaining the United States to a European audience and entertaining some of the really problematic issues that face all of us as a transatlantic community. So no one has brought up the word NATO. We can talk about that, but let's do it in the other room over a drink. And I want to thank you all for coming tonight and for what was really a great semester. Thank you all.